Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the first of our three-part series of cost management at CropTec. Obviously, it would have been great. We'd have all been preparing to attend CropTec next month, but the current situation means that unfortunately we're not able to do that. So what we wanted to do is to share with you some of the messages and have a discussion around some of the topics that we would have been sharing with you at the cost management hub that AHDB would have been hosting at CropTec this year. So for those of you who I haven't met before, my name's Emily Pope and I work in the Cereals and Oilseeds Knowledge Exchange team. So it's as I say, great that everyone's here with us this evening. We've got three fantastic speakers. Tonight we are discussing how you can stay ahead of the game. So we know that there's lots of challenges and changes and volatility that we face in the sector and in the industry. And what we want to discuss tonight is how we can look at critical performance data to understand how we can help you to stay ahead of the game. So AHDB has examined farm business performance data in Farm Bench, and tonight we're looking at that data over the last 2 harvest years. So as I say, we've got our three fantastic speakers lined up, and I'm going to ask each of them in turn to introduce themselves, please. So Philip, if we can start with you. I think you're on mute, Philip. Bear with us.
Schoolboy error. There we are, back now. Good evening, everybody. I'm Philip Dolbear, Knowledge Exchange Manager in the sunny southwest region of the UK. Not so sunny, the rain's set in here again. We're better off than last year though, but there's still a heck of a lot of wheat to be drilled, so we're still looking for a window break. But fortune is favouring the brave with us, but I don't know about anybody else, but the rate for those that stuck with it is looking good, so that's something to smile about.
Great, thank you, Philip. Mark?
Hi all, evening. My name's Mark Topliff. I'm a lead analyst in our farm economics team, and I do a lot of the analysing of the data that comes out of our Farm Bench programme, but also I look at other sources of data as well, look at performance on arable farms, as well as being involved in international network as well, looking at international farm data as well as obviously the data we have in the UK.
Thanks, Mark. And last but not least, live from the machinery sheds, we've got Harry Henderson.
Hello, good evening. Yes, I'm Harry Henderson, Knowledge Exchange Manager for AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds and Potatoes, and not too much of a work to do today, but just play devil's advocate when as and when necessary.
Brilliant, thank you, Harry. So Mark, if we can just move on to the first slide, we'll just run through, we've got some housekeeping for everybody. So as you probably already know, you will all stay on mute during the webinar, but we want to try and make these webinars as interactive as possible, so encouraging you to ask any questions and add to that discussion by using the question box that you'll find on the right hand side of your screen. So the webinar is due to finish around 8 p.m. So we'll make sure that we keep to time, but any questions that we don't get round to discussing and answering, we'll make sure that we get back in touch with you after the webinar. So the webinar this evening will be recorded and it will be published on YouTube and the AHDB website. So if you want to revisit any of the points that we covered tonight, you can do that. We have applied for basis and Noroso points. So again, just use the questions area to submit your details, and then we can send all of that off to basis and Noroso to get the points for you. You can follow along with the conversation on Twitter. So you can see there we've got our different Twitter handles for the different speakers. So you can follow us along on social media as well. So let's get started, Philip. I think on to our first speaker, Mark, if we can just move on to the first slide for Philip, and I'll hand over and we'll get started. Over to you, Philip.
Right, somebody's in charge of my mute button, I think. So we just wanted to spend a few minutes to start off tonight, giving some background to the figures and where they came from. If we just go on to the next slide, Mark, we're clearly as an industry, we're being pushed and pulled in a number of directions, trying to be more productive, more competitive, and there's always a business element. And it's a UK issue, it's an international issue. So there's lots and lots of things to think about. But as ever, we try and keep things simple and strip it right back. And going on, Mark, to the next slide, the old adage: if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So that's where we get back to. We want to break all the costs of production down to start analysing and discussing them. And that's where, for those that are familiar with you, the next slide shows Farm Bench. That's the sort of opening screen, which is AHDB's benchmarking tool, which is our sort of base tool to collect the data, to start analysing it and start discussing it. Next slide, Mark. It's a web-based tool. You can go in, log in yourself, put your own data in. It's safe and secure. It's now also multi-enterprise, in so much you can put in beef and lamb and other crops as well into the system, dairy too, and it pulls out a number of reports, which you obviously know your figures, but in terms of everybody else, it's totally anonymized. It is easy to use. It is there for you in your own offices, but there is a help desk support team which are there to pick up any queries. And we also in the knowledge exchange team around the country, working with the colleagues, are there to help you out as well if you get stuck. Now these slides will be available afterwards, but it's very easy to find on the AHDB website, basically .org.uk/farmbench. Next slide, Mark, please. The essence of it really is that it is a whole farm tool, and nothing gets left out, which we think is really important, because all the bills have got to be paid, including your own, to put a shirt on your back and food on your family plate. So and the landlord's got to be paid if you're a tenant and so on. So all costs of production go into it. You can put your own figures in for your own reports. However, we do use notional figures for unpaid labour, rent and finance. When it comes to group discussion, we think perhaps that is just taking things a bit too far to start sharing some of those figures with your neighbours. And the reason why we sort of really hone in and concentrate on total cost of production is because we believe that a knowledge of that will give you ultimate resilience going forward. And this next slide, Mark, will show a little bit of reasoning behind that. So that sort of passage of time going from left to right, and the price of wheat on the left-hand axis, that clearly wheat prices, we all know, goes up and down a hell of a lot. If we can aim and get costs of production, total costs of production, down to figures that in most years are below the output price, then obviously that's happy days. And if you follow the line along, you'll see that those with the lowest cost of production are the last to stop making money, but as prices recover, they're the first to start making money, which is obviously a good place to be. And we can be a bit more specific about that. And this slide here gives it's a 5-year span of the futures price. So again, benchmarking our cost of production price against the futures price. If you're below the futures price for more years than more not, obviously that stands you in good stead. One or two people are asking the question, well, we've had a bad year. We know it's a bad year. We don't really want to know how bad it is by putting all the figures in a computer and even less share them. But there are a lot of advantages to benchmarking, which the next slide will sort of cover very briefly. Clearly, there's for your own business. So you can look at what looks good and what looks bad in your view, and get your thought juices flowing to try and iron out the wrinkles and improve areas which you know are not so good. But the real benefits start coming as you start to work with the groups and start sharing your figures and building a bit of a comparison with local groups, but also you can look at national comparisons as well against the average figures and the top 25% figures. And ultimately, of course, there's a potential benefit of making sure as an industry we're meeting all the requirements and getting ourselves as a very well respected industry and a finely tuned and resilient financially industry as well. Next slide, markets. The real benefit, and I think where most interest comes with FarmBench, when we get into the smaller benchmarking groups, typically these are 10 or 12 people in a group, or up to 10 or 12 people. Above that, we find it's almost too big. Technically, your figures are anonymous, but if I'm honest, I don't think we've got a group yet where nobody said, well, we all know each other, we trust each other, you know, we'll get the most out of it by knowing each other's figures. But that only happens in those rooms. It doesn't happen anywhere else. But for those of you that have done it, you'll back me up, I'm sure. But for those who haven't been there, it's an absolutely fascinating time where you never stick to time. There's always too much to talk about, and we come back for more meetings and more discussions on different points. And I've got a few slides just going forward now, which sort of give a brief indication. Don't get too worried about the detail, but it just gives you an example. So these are some wheat figures looking at variable costs. This is a group of 12 farmers breaking down the different elements of variable costs and how each of the farms compare each other, looking at seed, fertilizers, crop protection, and so on. And then if we want, and we did with this group, we then took, say, the crop protection costs and we broke those down further again. So to look at herbicides, fungicides, and insecticide costs and so on. So you can see now you're starting to see which farmers, which columns have got particularly good sections and those are not so good. And you can imagine the debate starts to go, how did you do that? Or why are you not so good at this? And away it goes. And the last of these slides, and that was where we can do fixed costs as well. And here's some wheat machinery, labour and power costs, including depreciation and contracting. So again, different colours representing different angles of the fixed cost structure to analyse and share and discuss where we all are. As mentioned before, that you can do this on your own at home. You can select how your benchmarking report comes out, so you can select who you want to compare against. Clearly, the more criteria you stipulate, the less the field of comparison gets, but you can go, if you really want to, right through to comparing farms in your region on your soil type with your rainfall if you know that specific data. And yes, it'll be a smaller group, but it becomes a very meaningful comparison then. The crop reports, so we go on to the next slide, Mark, show your performance on the left-hand column of figures there against top 25%, middle 50%, and bottom 25% farms. Clearly, you hope you're not in the bottom 25%. It's always good to see where you are against the top 25%. And what FarmBench now also does, in this last slide here, it enables you to put all your enterprises in your arbor rotation together. So your wheat, your barley, your rape, and so on. And now we can put in some environmental stewardship schemes in there as well as a column as part of your rotation, and it will bring up for us an overall whole crop rotation set of benchmarks for output, fixed costs, variable cost, fixed costs, and net margin. So you can start to play around with what different crop combinations will do to your rotation. Emily's appeared, which means she might have a question, but actually it's very timely because I've actually finished what I wanted to say. But hopefully that gives you guys, everybody, a run through of what FarmBench looks like and where some of the figures we're now going to talk about come from. Emily.
Brilliant, thank you, Philip. No, you've done my job for me and perfectly set the scene to move on to Mark, who's going to take us through the analysis of those figures, but hopefully that provides everyone with a good background to where those figures have come from and how we can start looking at them in the analysis. So we'll move straight on to Mark.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Philip. So yes, good background in terms of what FarmBench is all about, and we've spent the last sort of few weeks really trawling through the sort of data that we've got in FarmBench to see if we can pull out some interesting points, trends, messages that we can share with the likes of yourselves tonight and others over the next sort of few weeks and into next year. So what I'm going to cover tonight is the results of specifically winter feed wheat, all conventional feed wheat, and then we'll just summarise what those findings are and give you some take-home messages from what we've shown. We've analysed the figures of around about sort of 640 wheat enterprises, so it's a relatively large set of data. Going back over the 2 years of 2018, 2019. And what I'm going to talk about is the performance of the top 25% versus the bottom 25% and even the middle 50% guys. And these performance groups have been ranked on net margin results. So just to clarify what we mean by net margin, so net margin is the income from the crop, so that's the grain and the straw, minus the cash costs, the costs you actually would pay out, you physically pay a check for, but also we include the value of unpaid labour, the rental value of owned land and depreciation as well. And these are what we call the economic costs. This allows us then to put all the data on the same basis so that we can do a fair like-for-like comparison. And it should be noted we don't include any subsidies in the figures. So let's have a look at the first slide of the results, and we're going to start with actually looking at the net margin results. Let's start at what's probably the most important figures is the margin at the end of the day. So this is, like I say, the last 2 years, 2018, 2019, and what we've seen is when you compare the top 25% with the middle performers, the difference is over 1.5 times higher, and even when you compare to the bottom 25%, it's over 3 times higher. So we see in this large sample of ours that there's a huge range in the performance between the top 25% and the bottom 25%. Now, many of those in the top 25% were also in 2018 and the 2019 figures, so they're fairly consistent. Now, you may be looking at these figures and you may already have a view on what you think these top 25% performers are like. So I'm just going to, on the next slide, just to good to sort of challenge maybe our sort of preconceived idea of what these farms are like. So what I've done, I've taken here 2 farms that appear in this winter wheat sample, and just given a bit of background to what these farms sort of look like in terms of physical characteristics, and then I'm going to present some of the sort of wheat performance figures for these 2 farms. But the difference is one is actually in the top 25% and one appears in the bottom 25%. And be interesting to see if you can sort of work out which may be which from the information that I give you. So firstly, we can see these 2 farms, both located in the same region. Both got got loam type soils. Using our AHDB weather hub, I was able to find out actually during the 2018-19 growing season, the rainfall was very similar for both those farms. We do see a difference though in terms of total cropping area, with Farm B having over twice the area being cropped than the Farm A. If we bring up the specific wheat enterprise figures for last year, we can see that Farm A has fewer 8 hectares being grown than Farm B, but their cultivation and drilling process is exactly the same, but their number of treatment passes is different. So what I mean by treatment passes is the number of times they've passed with fertilizer and sprays. So Farm A has done more of those passes than Farm B. So far we've seen some similarities, some differences, what about how the wheat performed? Well, actually, both the farms had very similar wheat yields, and even the wheat income on a per hectare basis was almost exactly the same. So if you look at these two farms, could we tell which could actually be in the top 25% and which is in the bottom 25%? I'm going to bring in Philip or Harry. I don't know if you want to sort of give any thoughts on, you know, what people might be thinking in terms of which ones of those might be the top 25% performer.
Well, I'm guessing that the only line I can see any difference is in your treatment passes, Mark. So, and I'm assuming it costs less to go with 6 times than it does 10 times, unless they've got super duper a big chunky machinery that costs twice as much.
Yeah. Harry, any thoughts? What do you think people might think is the farm that appears in the top 25%?
By the organizer. Here we are. Right. There's nothing that stands out there, is there? I mean, the rainfall is very similar. The treatments are different, but you know that could be a red herring as far as I'm concerned, because you know the 10 passes may be justified. The 6 passes may for some seem better, but then perhaps that's the wrong thing to do. So it's very difficult to separate the two out at the minute.
Yeah. Well, let's reveal. Let's see if everybody at home has got this right then. So actually, Farm A is the top 25% performer, and Farm B is the bottom 25% performer. So despite the fact that, you know, in terms of those physical characteristics and the production systems being fairly similar, actually one is performing at one end of the scale compared to the other. And if we look at the difference in the wheat net margin, there was over £600 per hectare difference in that margin between the two. So it's just to sort of really sort of challenge initially maybe what we think is a top performing farm when you just look at it. It isn't maybe what we necessarily think to start with, but let's go through the figures in a little bit more detail now and see what we can tease out.
Mark, just before we move on, we've had a question in, and you've brought up that net margin difference. We've had a question come in around just defining what you mean by net margin. Could you just clarify what you mean by that, and is it the same as gross margin?
Right, so net margin is taking the income from the crop, and the income will be the grain and straw, taking from the income all the costs, so your variable costs and your overhead costs, to leave a net margin. So your gross margin will just be your income minus your variable costs. We've also taken off the overhead costs, all the fixed costs as well.
Brilliant,
Okay.
thank you.
It's blooming close to profit, isn't it?
It's very close to profit, exactly. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so we've seen that physical characteristics aren't necessarily the difference between the top and bottom performers. Let's now sort of delve into figures a little bit further, and let's start first with looking at income and yield. So just to explain this chart to start with, so what we've got are these individual dots, and each of these dots represents a wheat enterprise. And what we're doing, we're looking at the total income of those enterprises versus the yield tons per hectare. And what we're seeing is, what's that trend? What's that relationship between income and yield? I'm sure you can all see there's definitely some trend, some upward trend, that the higher the income that was gained, the higher the yield that came with it. So that's I think it's quite clear. The dots are quite close together as well, so that all indicates quite a strong association between yield and income. I think one of the things to point out, though, we can see here we've coloured the dots according to which performance group they're in. So these sort of dark blue dots are the top 25% performers. You can see they actually are a sort of wide range in terms of the yield that they achieved and also a wide range in terms of income, but they still appeared in the top 25% based on net margin. So our lowest in the top 25% had a yield of about 7.5 tonnes per hectare, and the highest had something around about sort of 12 to 12.5 tonnes per hectare, 13. So it isn't necessarily the case that the higher the yield is necessary to get the higher income. So there's something else played in there. But before we sort of look at other areas, let's have a look at the other income side of things, which is the price of the grain. Now this is comparing the wheat price, which was achieved by, on average, the top 25% and the bottom and the middle 50%. And you can see there's not a huge difference. There is some difference. The top 25% on average gained about sort of 7 to 10 pounds per tonne compared to the bottom 25%. So there is some difference, but I don't know. Harry and Philip, I mean, would you expect that sort of difference, or would you expect it to be more or even less?
Mark, I'm not sure what I'd expect really, apart from to say, as you say, there's not a massive difference in price, relatively speaking, depending which group you're in. So I guess this is where you're taking us, but you know, there's more things to dig into as to why the top 25% to the top 25% is doesn't look like price. Looking at that. Yeah,
I'd agree. Everyone talks about price, and everyone talks about what they got, the price for their feed wheat, but it's clearly, you know, fairly similar. So there's very little to pick out of it. So more digging required.
Yeah. And statistically speaking, we don't see a very strong linkage between price and income compared to yield anyway. I mean, if you do sort of delve into the individual results, and if you say look at a wheat price which was achieved of £140 per tonne, we actually see that every performance group had someone who got £140 a tonne for their wheat. However, all those in the bottom group made a loss at that price, and all those in the top group made profit. So it's interesting that, you know, price is not quite as influential as maybe what we think. Let's move on to the other side of things. So we've talked about income. What about costs? And this is just to show the difference between the top and bottom 25% in terms of that net margin. So the difference in the net margin is shown by this chart here for each of the years. And if you split that difference in net margin between the top and bottom by what came from the income and what came from the cost, this is what you get. So roughly speaking, between the 2 years, between the best and the worst, even between the best and the middle 50%, roughly 50% of that difference in net margin was due to income, so a higher income, and roughly 50% came from lower costs. Okay, so we've looked at income just now. Let's delve into the cost side of things and see what we can sort of see through that side of things. Firstly, let's have a look at costs. Okay, what makes up these costs? So we look at all costs. We look at the variable costs and the fixed costs, the overhead costs, including values for unpaid labour and rent as well. This is just a breakdown. This is just a breakdown of the average feed wheat cost of production, and you can see it's around £1,300 per hectare. Now, there's 5 big cost areas that we can see there. So we've got fertilizers. We've got crop protection, we've got total labour, machinery and equipment, and rent. So they're all in that sort of 14 to sort of 22% region in terms of the slice of that pie. Now, when you look at the difference in terms of cost of production between the top and the bottom, the top 25% had a cost of production of £1,150 per hectare in the last 2 years. The bottom quartile had costs which were £400 per hectare more. So a significant higher cost of production figure for those bottom 25%. What we're going to do now, we could look at all these different cost areas, but because of time and we thought actually let's look at the biggest slice of that pie and look at the machinery and equipment, which makes up 22% of those average cost production figures. Now, machinery and equipment, is part of the overheads. Now, I thought I'd just show you how much of the overheads contributes to that difference. So, of that sort of difference in terms of net margin that costs contribute to, overheads makes up the vast difference. We're talking something around about sort of £350, £330 per hectare. So it's no surprise that, as we've just seen, that labour and machinery is the biggest part of that overhead cost. And so what we've also seen is the overheads has just as strong a influence on the net margin as income as well. Let's break down the sort of machinery and the contracting costs that we see between the top and the bottom, and this is averaged across the 2 years. So the areas where we've seen the main differences is in the machinery equipment depreciation between the top and bottom, the equipment spares and repairs, and in those contracting costs. Now, we've split these into enterprise and general contracting. So enterprise specific contracting is contracting done with that wheat enterprise, specifically just for that wheat enterprise. And general contracting is contracting that's done generally around the farm, and this is the wheat's share of that contracting cost. Now, these, if you were sort of looking at, how can we sort of look at cost efficiencies, these would be the best or the main key areas to look at those efficiencies. Now, if we include labour and we look at the contracting costs specifically, let's have a look at this here. This is again looking at total labour versus the contract and the contracting cost versus the bottom 25%. If you've got, I don't know, higher labour costs, would you assume that you'd have lower contracting costs? Harry and Philip, what do you think?
You'd like to think so. Yeah, if you're using a contractor for some of the larger jobs, spraying or combining, then you are saving labour. So you'd like to think that that would be the case. Yeah. If you're doing extra work as well as having the staff on board as well, then yeah, it looks like that's what's happening in this case.
And it would be the same if you had higher machinery costs. Would you then expect that you'd have lower contracting and labour costs as well?
You would. It's interesting on the previous slide that some of the costs of depreciation and repair costs are both high on the left-hand side there. So how some of these guys are getting away with £103 worth of depreciation per hectare, plus the higher end, or the much higher end really, of repairs, where traditionally, if you've got relatively fresh machinery, you should be seeing low repair costs, as against the lower depreciation might see higher repair costs. But that doesn't seem to be the case here, and these guys are getting contractors in as well. So there's a clear case for control, and step back and look at what you're doing. Is it operator training? Is it accidental repairs? Is it machinery wearing out in terms of repairs and maintenance? So there's a lot to discuss there.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Harry. So we see there £103 hectare difference in terms of that total labour and contracting costs between the top and bottom. So again, significant difference of, yeah, an area where there's obviously some cost savings to be made or cost efficiencies to be made with those performers. If we group labour costs and machinery costs together and compare those, what we see is that there's a 30% difference then between the highest and the lowest. And as Harry's just mentioned, you know, you'd expect if you've got low machinery costs, that if you've got machinery to do the job, that you wouldn't need the contractors, that you may need lower labour costs. And so it's interesting to see that those bottom 25% seems to just have a lot more of those costs, and so it amounts to a 30% difference. Now, some of the ways that people look at trying to reduce these costs is to spread those costs over more hectares, increase the area that they farm, or increase the size of the enterprise. It's a sort of common strategy. So I thought, actually, Ness, let's look at the economies of scale then. Let's look at whether, you know, increasing the area that you grow the crop, whether that actually reduces the costs. So what we've got here is the area of winter wheat that's grown along the bottom here, and the total machinery and equipment cost per hectare up the left-hand side. And again, all these dots represent an individual wheat enterprise, and they're all color-coded depending on which performance group they appear in. So I think you could probably quite see there's no strong trend or no clear economies of scale here. We have large areas that have been grown up here, which have got very similar machinery and equipment costs to much smaller wheat enterprises down at this end. We've got obviously a lot more growing wheat in this sort of size of area, but other than that, we're not seeing any strong trend there at all. So certainly within this range of data that we've got, we can say there's no clear economies of scale. What if we sort of look at the labour machinery and compare that to the influence of price and yield on net margin, and just see whether, you know, does that have a more or less influence on it than those other two income factors. Now, again, these dots here represent individual wheat enterprises, and the thing to look at here is just how close are those dots to that trend line that you can see in each of these charts. Now, if they're quite close to that trend line, it means that there's a very strong relationship between the two variables. So here we can see in the price chart that these dots are quite well spread out. So there's not a strong link between the price that you receive and your resultant net margin. Those dots get a little bit closer together to that trend chart when you look at yield versus net margin. But when you look at total machinery and labour costs, you can see that those dots are much closer to that trend line. And so we have seen, and statistically we've worked out that relationship between labour and machinery and net margin is stronger than that we see with yield or price alone. So let's just summarise what we've found then. Firstly, when you look at that difference between the net margin of the top 25% and the bottom performers, around about half of that difference is due to the income side of things, and half of it is due to the cost of production. When you look at yield, yield is is a bigger driver of crop income than price, and on its own is slightly less stronger association than with the labour machinery costs, which has a larger influence than yield or price alone. So that summarises sort of the key findings to date in terms of what we've got. We are doing more analysis of this data. There's more to go into, but just to leave you with some key messages, some take-home messages that before we sort of go into questions. And the first would be, well, we can see that when you look at those top 25% performance, you can see they don't just focus on yield. So we saw that wide range in yield from 7.5 tonnes per hectare to 12, 13 tonnes per hectare. What they seemed to do was really concentrate as well on their cost production structures. Also, what we saw is that they paid attention to all areas of crop management that were within their control. It was about doing something in each area rather than concentrating on just one or two. The other thing we saw was that, that association between labour and machinery costs and net margin. And so it's about looking at, do you have the optimum cost structure of your labour and machinery for the sort of structure that you're looking for with your wheat enterprise? And is your strategy of how you're investing in your machinery equipment, is it really working in your favour? Is there something around that you may have to sort of sit back and sort of review and really think, well, actually this isn't really getting me the cost savings that I want in all areas. And the other thing we saw is there was no clear economies of scale. So if you were, say, in the bottom 25% and you wanted to expand and you went to expand, then you're probably unlikely to improve your net margin position just by doing that. So it's probably better to get better in terms of your net margin performance before getting bigger, so you can carry that through that performance over a larger farm. So just to leave you the strap line that we came up with is that attention to detail is king, and the yield is normally known as king, but in this context we feel yield is the prince. So Harry and Philip, is there anything you'd like to sort of add or any thoughts around those messages and key findings?
I think Mark, you've sort of encapsulated what happens in many of our benchmarking group meetings, in so much that, and this is perhaps to give confidence in anybody that's thinking of coming to a group, there's nothing to be frightened of, because nobody is best or top 25% even in absolutely every category in the accounts. So even the top net margin 25% performer, he will have an area of his cost structure or maybe his income where he isn't achieving as well as somebody else in the group. So there's always something to learn from somebody, and it is that sort of across the board attention to detail in all areas that really build up to create good performance rather than any one particular area.
Absolutely. We've started doing some work looking at the top 25% performers and those that appear in that top 25% consistently. And what we've seen with some early findings, which we'll share at some future webinar or presentation, is that they are consistent. They're consistent with their level of costs. They're consistent with their performance. And so that's what seems to keep them in that top 25%. We're going to delve in a little bit further with those growers and just see, what specifics are they doing which may keep them consistent in that top group. Harry, was there anything you wanted to add around those key messages?
I think there's two things really. The economies of scale. There's lots of people for many years have said, what do you need to do to protect yourself from poor profits is gain scale, get land and grow. And throughout benchmarking, we found fairly early on, we had a 200-acre guy that was just had 200 acres of combinable crops, sat next to a 6,500-acre guy of combinable crops. And the 200-acre guy had a lower cost of production, but he knew he had to trim his costs. He knew he had to tighten the belt. He knew that he had to get the contractor in to do the combining and so on. The 6,500-acre guy didn't feel he needed to do too much of that because the scale that he had would cover that off. So it was a bit of a shock. So also renting land, outbidding your neighbour on 40 acres of land that's 15 miles away can be a costly business. So just be aware of the amount of extra time and effort that goes into renting land that's a little bit further away from the home base. And the machinery, we're only talking in a meeting this morning to go out to beef and lamb farmers that if you've got a shed full of shiny machinery, make sure that yes, it's an investment, yes, it's an asset, but make sure it's working for you. It's certainly not an asset that you can sell for more money. So the machinery that you have in the shed has to earn its keep on the farm and has to help you turn a profit. It's not going to be traded in back to the dealer at a profit, that's for sure.
Yeah, and just to back some of that up, Harry, I mean, certainly looking at some of the growers in the top 25% and their machinery costs, they don't necessarily have the lowest average machinery costs. But what they've done, if they've got higher than average machinery costs, their labour and contracting costs are lower, to almost sort of as a mitigation of that. So overall, their labour and machinery costs are lower than the bottom and middle 50%.
And it's right. And when you really start drilling down into the finer details of machinery costs, you come up against each individual farmer's attitude to risk. Can they afford no breakdowns at harvest? They don't want anything. So then, yes, they have the most modern combine that gets looked after by the dealer, and they have a program of a dealer care program with it. Or there's the guys that can stand a bit of risk. They run cheaper equipment, but do take the risk of a breakdown, which they may repair themselves or get a local guy in to repair it. So you drill down to that level of detail, and then on the way home from a benchmarking meeting, you think, okay, what's my attitude to risk? And it's a very powerful conversation to have.
Of course, the other balance now, Harry, that's been very clear over the last couple of harvests is capacity, and what price do you put on the ability to go out and chop an awful lot of hectares off very quickly in catchy windows? And again, that's risk attitude, isn't it?
It is, and there's a train of thought that you would like to go for a higher capacity combine to get in a catchy season. You can get some grain in the middle of the day without running it through a dryer. And one combine driver at a meeting said, well, that's okay, but if you've got a catchy season and you've got a big combine, you end up with yards full of wet grain. So, okay, so there's some balance to be had here, and you can't disregard your drying capacity either.
Brilliant, thanks everyone. We've got some questions that we've had coming in through the chat, so and if anyone's got any more, please keep sending them in. But I'll just run through a few of them now. So we've got a question come in around, do these costs include hire purchase payments? Mark, I don't know if you want to clarify that.
Yes, they would. They'd include anything to do with hire equipment and hire purchase. Yeah.
Okay. Next question, probably again to you, Mark. Do these figures also take account of other croppings that are going on the farm, for example, veg?
So some of the costs in there, they would be shared amongst the other crops that are on the farm. So the way Farm Bench works is you can put in a cost for some of the overheads, and then what you do is then allocate those out to the different crops. And actually, one of the beauties of Farm Bench is it does some of that allocation for you automatically based on what you've already put in. I won't sort of bore you with the detail, but so it does take into account other crops in that sense, yes.
I think, Emily, can I just come in there? I think that's a really important point, because although we've just been looking at wheat here, and one would hope that wheat is the majority crop in a rotation, and it would therefore be indicative of the whole rotation, whole farm, or whole arable enterprise performance anyway. Clearly, there are other crops in that rotation. If you've got a load of oilseed rape and rubbishy spring beans or something, good wheat performance and very quickly topple down across the whole farm if everything else is untoward. So, and as you say, Mark, we can sort of build up that overall picture of an arable enterprise with different crops. So, and that's important to do rather than look at one wheat crop in isolation. And as we've done here, 2 years data, and the more years the better, because one swallow doesn't make a summer, does it?
Yeah, as you showed earlier, Philip, we've got the multi-enterprise reports that allow you to do that comparison across the crops in terms of those costs. So you can just see what share those crops have got, but you can also see in total some of those costs as well across the rotation.
So Philip, you mentioned there, we've got 2 years worth of data that we've looked at tonight, and we've had a question in around the data set. How many data sets and what does that represent for the industry? So, in terms of the data sets that this analysis is used, is that 10% of the wind, of the feed wheat in the UK, or what kind of percentage does it represent, Mark?
The answer is not enough, I would say, whatever the figure is. I mean, I think we're on something like 2,000 arable data sets in the country now, and there's 40,000 registered arable producers. So, yes, it's a good statistical set of data, but there's a lot of scope to increase it. And I would advocate, and some would say, well, you're bound to say that, aren't you? But I really, really do believe that everybody ought to know their cost of production, because if you don't know your costs, you don't know your profit. And you need to know that now, because it's going to get very, very important very quickly.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in around asking about relationships in the data, and if there's any other associations between different factors. So the first one is there a relationship between age of decision maker and net profit? And then the second one is there any correlation between profitability and tillage regime, i.e. plough, min-till or direct drill? So should we start with the age of decision maker? Mark, I don't know if you...
Yeah, no, both good questions. We haven't looked at that yet. Farm Bench doesn't capture that information, but I know that there has been some surveys done in the past by DEFRA and others, and I'm not sure there is a strong correlation between the two. Education is the other thing that's looked at. But yeah, I wouldn't sort of know what the sort of findings of those really would be. In terms of tillage and the net margin, it's actually something that's interests us as well. So we are going to look into that. It's something which I think it'll be interesting to see whether there's a strong association between them. Or not, because certainly we've got systems out there where you've got your lower input, lower output type systems and your higher input, higher output systems. Now, does one perform better than the other, or do they perform just as well as each other? And how much does the sort of tillage system influence that? So it's one that we're going to be looking at. So keep posted and look out for when we do a webinar on that.
I guess, Emily, that go on, you go, Harry.
I was just going to add, I think with the tillage systems, it's attention to detail with either tillage system you go for. If you're plough and power harrow type guy, then it's attention to detail, and if it's min-till or it's no-till, it's attention to detail that'll win out in the end. So whatever you do, be good at it and take the time to get it right.
Yeah, something we see not just in arable sector, but actually in other sectors. When you've got a system that's neither one or the other, that's when you see a greater number of poor performers, because they haven't quite honed what their system is. Their cost structure tends to be all over the place. So it makes it very difficult to sort of run those efficiencies and pay attention to detail if you're not quite sure what system you're really trying to run.
I guess there's another question here, and it's a longer term one that might unfold with time, and probably it would start a raging debate for another 2 hours. But if there's any relationship between tillage system and soil health, and we're led to believe, and we're all now working towards better soils and more diversity, and what are the impacts of that in terms of input costs, in terms of nutrients, in terms of crop protection, and whether that will feed back into the net margin position. But again, that's an unfolding story over years to come, I think.
Yeah, leading on from that, we've had a question come in, and I assume it's related to soil management, but it could be related to pest and disease management as well. Does the difference between performance groups vary more in a wet year, or is it generally consistent? So Mark, I don't know if you mentioned about the weather data. I don't know if you've ever been able to have a look at.
Yeah, generally, what we're seeing in terms of the headline figures is generally doesn't seem to be a difference between a wet and a dry year. The trend seems to be fairly similar, and the differences in terms of percentage terms anyway are fairly similar. So it doesn't seem to vary that much depending on what the year is. Again, if you look at the top 25% guides and those who are consistently in that top 25%, they're just consistent in what they do really. That their cost structure is consistent, what their structure, their system is consistent, and that seems to what keeps them there no matter what the season sort of brings them really.
And in terms of geographical distribution of our different groups, is there any relationship between part of the country and the best performers?
We have looked at that. I'm not going to say if there is or isn't at the moment, because I need to do further, let's just say statistical analysis of it to just to see whether the differences are real or not. So once we've done that, again, we'll share that. But we can do that. We can look at different regions and we can compare between countries, and it's something we're interested in sharing.
Yeah,
that's one for the next webinar.
Yeah, I would guess it could be a bit like yield. You know, there's some 12 ton per week yield people that are in the bottom 25%, and equally the other end of the scale, there's some 7 ton a hectare wheat people that are in the top 25%, and I suspect it's the same in geography. But as you say, the statisticians will have their say.
Someone's asked a question around the large reduction in overhead costs and the difference between 2018 and 2019, and whether that can be explained. I'm trying to think back to one of your graphs, Mark, and if we can.
I'll go back to.
Yeah, how can the large reduction in overhead costs be explained between 2018 and 2019?
So that could be due down to the season itself. We had two very different years, didn't we, there? And so I know that there's probably differences in terms of number of treatment passes, the types of cultivations that were needed. So in 2018, probably more input was required in terms of machinery and labour because of the type of season it was compared to 2019.
What's interesting there, Mark, is I'm just trying to line up the screen in front of me, but there's less variation between the top 25% in the 2 years than there is between the bottom 25%. So again, as you say, it comes back to that sort of consistency story, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay.
I'm conscious of time, but we've got some fantastic questions coming in, so I'll keep going. For those of you that need to dash off to get your dinners or whatever, just to remind you that the webinar will be recorded, and any questions that we don't get around to covering, we'll make sure that we get in touch with you directly to provide a response to those. So our next question is, how do cover or catch crops get valued in farm bench? Are they a cost associated with the wheat crop or as an overhead?
Probably one for Philip, that one.
Yeah, we're putting catch and cover crops in a separate column, and they get spread across the whole rotation, and the benefit of them as well if there's any grazing on them.
Brilliant. Next question, any correlation between involvement in environmental schemes and you know, where people fall in their top 25 or bottom 25% category?
Yeah, again, an interesting question. It's again not one we've looked at. We don't separate out any environmental involvement in the farm bench data, so it'll be looking elsewhere to see whether any of the data sort of shows that. But certainly in the data we've got, we can't do that and sort of say whether that's the case or not.
It's something, Emily, we're working on, because we see stewardship schemes becoming an important part of rotations. So we're making farm bench work so that we can pick that up as part of the overall picture.
Brilliant. I think we've got lots of lots of questions and points of discussion to take forward in some analysis for a future webinar, Mark. So we'll run another one of these, I'm sure. So as I say, conscious of time, we've got to 8 o'clock. I can't leave the question section without asking a final question to Harry. Someone's asking, what's the old tractor in the background?
I thought you'd never ask. It is a 1929 International Industrial 20, so it's a 1020, but it's an industrial version with solid rubber tyres. That's what you can see in the background.
We think Harry's got the best office out of all of us, actually, so quite jealous of that one, Harry. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to everyone again who's contributed to the discussion, putting the questions in. As I say, we will get back to you and provide answers to all of those, or at least point you in the right direction of where we'll provide those answers in the future. So Mark, if we can just move on to the last few slides. We've just got a few updates to let you know of some more webinars that are coming up over the next few months. So the next one in the cost management at CropTec series is taking place on the 4th of November. So Mark, if you just move on to the next slide, we can share with you the details of that. So the next webinar is going to be looking at some of the factors that we've discussed this evening and how we can actually put them into practice on farm to build a stronger farm business. So we've got 3 farmers who use FarmBench and are sharing their critical performance data with us and looking at the differences and the commonalities between each of the farm businesses and what they can share and learn from one another. So that's taking place on the 4th of November. All details for that are online, ahdb.org.uk/events. Then the final instalment for the cost management at CropTec is on the 7th of December. This is forming part of our Monitor Farm Mondays series of webinars. So our Monitor Farm meetings over the winter period this year will be replaced by a series of webinars taking place every Monday starting in November. And the final instalment of the cost management at CropTec series will be joining forces with Gary, who's our Huggett Monitor Farmer, and Rose Ryby, who's our Knowledge Exchange Manager in the Northeast, and we'll be looking at integrating pigs into the arable rotation and the cost benefit of that in terms of increasing organic matter. Then in December, we are replacing our agronomists conference with a week-long series of webinars and interactive sessions in agronomy weeks. That starts Monday the 30th of November and will conclude on Friday the 4th of December. So you can register for that on our events page as well. So all that leaves me to do is again thank all of our speakers. Thank you to the audience for attending and for joining in and submitting all of those questions. Just to remind you that there will be a survey that appears at the end of this webinar. As I said, it's being recorded, so you can follow up on YouTube and on the AHDB website at another time. As I say, we will get back to you with those questions. If you have got any questions or point of clarification and you want to get in touch, please get in touch with me using the email address there, emily.pope@ahdb.org.uk. If you're interested in joining a arable business group, if you're interested in using FarmBench to to understand your own business and to add to this data set and to get all of that shared learning out of it, please do get in touch and we look forward to helping you do that. So thank you very much and hope to see you soon. Good night.